So pumped to be here talking to you, Alex. How are you?
I am doing well, man. Nice to finally meet live.
Yeah, seriously. Well, this is going to be great. So for everybody who just tuned in, we're here with Alex Lieberman, co-founder and chairman of Morning Brew. In my opinion, if it matters, it's one of the most exciting media companies out there. So for everybody tuning in, if you don't know what Morning Brew is, hit pause on the video right now. Go to morningbrew.com, subscribe to one of their newsletters. Better yet, subscribe to all of them. You'll be the smartest person in the room. It's not a guarantee, but I think it's true.
I appreciate that. Love the vote of confidence.
Cool. So I think a lot of people have when in our company when they heard that I was going to be talking to you for the conference, I had a ton of people throwing questions at me. Oh, you got to ask him this, you got to ask him that. So let's just dive in.
Let's do it.
We can have a lot of fun with this. So a lot of people, particularly a lot of people who are watching this video right now, have either started their own business, worked for someone who started their own business, or are one day dreaming of starting their own business. So take us back to the beginning. What were you doing? Where were you in life? And like, what was the tipping point where you said, I got like a bunch of safe routes I can go down career wise, but actually I'm going to do this thing. Just paint that picture for us.
Totally. So I will try to keep this short. But basically, it goes back to college. My co-founder, Austin Reef, and myself were students at the University of Michigan. We started the business when I was a senior and he was a sophomore. We were actually in the same fraternity, but didn't realize that. He was just a reader of my original newsletter, which I'll explain in a second. But the business started very much by happenstance. The business was a hobby before it was a business. We weren't looking to be entrepreneurs. We were more just thrust into entrepreneurship accidentally. And obviously, 6 years later, it fundamentally changed our lives. Basically, what happened was I come from a Wall Street family. My dad, my mom, my grandpa all worked on Wall Street. That was my dream growing up. I literally had on my whiteboard in my room, in my childhood room, be the best trader in the world. Like that was one of my goals on my bucket list, which no one else, obviously, no other normal human being has, but I had it because my role models worked on Wall Street and that was the only option I saw in career. So that's why I went to Michigan. I was in the business school there and I was very much on the track. Like I was on the track that everyone was on. Took my classes in the business school, had my internships after freshman year, sophomore year, junior year. Get into my senior year at Michigan. I accepted my job offer at Morgan Stanley to work in sales and trading mortgages, the very same product that my dad had traded for 20 years. And I had all this free time. I only had to take two classes my whole senior year. I didn't have to re-recruit for a job. And so I started passing the time, one, by playing a shit ton of FIFA, but also by helping students prep for job interviews. And I would always ask in these conversations, how do you keep up with the business world? And every student would say, I read the Wall Street Journal. And I would ask why. And they'd be like, well, because it's my only option. It's what my parents told me to do. And I'd be like, do you enjoy it? And they'd be like, no, it's dense, it's dry, but I don't have another option. So at some point I was like, this is crazy. Like these kids are working their asses off to have careers in business, yet they don't have content that story tells the business world in an engaging and accessible way. I didn't say it so eloquently at the time. I was more like, this is dumb. Why isn't there something better? And so I started writing a daily business roundup. It was called Market Corner. It was a PDF. It was basically the OG Morning Brew, had 5 stories I condensed, a stock pitch of the day, an inspirational quote of the day, an interview question of the day, and a activist investor of the day. And I took a Microsoft template. It's where I put together the newsletter. I converted it to a PDF. I attached it in an email and I started sending it to all the kids I was prepping for job interviews and then like family members. And it started getting traction, which was really strange to me because it was impossible to sign up for. There was no website. If you wanted to read this newsletter, you had to hit me up and be like, hey, Alex, can you add me to your listserv so I can get your newsletter? Turns out one of the original readers on my listserv was Austin Reef. And when I had reached out to my group of readers, probably in December of 2014, saying, hey, I'm going to take this thing a little bit more seriously. There's traction here. I want to make it into a business and like an actual email newsletter. Does anyone want to help me? Austin had reached out to me and he was like, hey, I'd love to help out with your newsletter of ideas for how it could be better. We met up and he basically spent 45 minutes ripping my newsletter to shreds. And while it was like personally provoking to my ego, it was also one of the most helpful conversations I'd ever had. It was really my first lesson actually in entrepreneurship, even though I wasn't thinking of things as a business, because it made me realize how generally unhelpful 99% of people were in providing advice to me, because their advice wasn't advice. It was more like celebration. But by people not saying like, this is how your product can be better, this is what you should do, there's no way for me to actually evolve the product. And I was like, wow, this 18-year-old who has such amazing mental maturity and is so blunt, it's something I'm not used to, but it's something that also is so complimentary to me, because like I was very much like, I have 50 ideas, my brain goes in 1,000 directions. To have someone who is both so direct, someone who was so focused on the most efficient way to get from point A to point B, I was like, I'm not thinking about this as a business. I just want to surround myself with this person. So Austin joined. We launched Morning Brew in March of 2015 as an email newsletter. And the final point I'll add here, because the last part of your question was about like, how do we decide to go full time? It was not an easy decision. It was very much like a year in the making. I had graduated from Michigan. When I graduated, I think we had 10,000 subscribers. I did not feel comfortable going full-time on Morning Brew when I graduated. I just could not bring myself to go to my mom, who I told for my entire life, like, oh, I'm going to work on Wall Street, and tell her, hey, I'm actually going to turn down my dream job to go work on this newsletter thing. So I went and joined Morgan Stanley. I was there for a year. Austin was still in school. September of 2016, we decided to go full time. So Austin, I would actually posit, like, took the bigger risk. He didn't even join a bank out of school. He literally graduated, turned down his first job offer ever, and joined me. And we went full time in September of 2016. And there are two things that made me make the decision. One is I thought about things in terms of worst case scenario. What is the worst case scenario if I go full time on Morning Brew and it fails? And the way I answered that question was like, well, if I go full time on Morning Brew and it fails 6 months from now, what are my options? One, hopefully I can go back to Morgan Stanley with a story about how I learned how to build teams, raise money, etc. If that doesn't work and I burn those bridges, hopefully it's a good business school application. If for whatever reason I can't get into business school with that, maybe I've met people in the startup scene to join another startup or build something else. And I got like 4 or 5 layers deep. And I was like, if I don't have any options 5 layers down, that's not a Morning Brew problem. That's like Alex Lieberman not building genuine relationships with people problem. So that was number one. And the second thing was junior year of college, my life was fundamentally changed. I lost my dad instantly. He passed away from a stroke a week before my junior year. Perfectly healthy guy, no signs of anything, in the same shape as me. And it really just, like, as cliche as it sounds, like it changed my perspective, and it made me realize that like doing shit that actually gives me energy and I enjoy is really, really important, because you just don't know when the shot clock's going to go down to 0. And so I actually don't think I would have been able to make the decision so easily to jump had that not have happened in my life. And so obviously a really tragic thing, but I very much tried to turn it into a motivator.
Wow. So that brings me to an interesting point, which is not just starting the company, but as you began to scale it, in most cases, there's sacrifices involved, right? In the sense of you're doing something new and innovative. You're doing something that's essentially never been done before, at least the way that you guys were doing it. You're, as young people, learning how to perform at a world-class level, or what you think is a world-class level. But there's, like, in amidst all that, there's no such thing as a free lunch, right? Like, there have to be trade-offs involved.
Totally.
of doing what you did. Like, what was that? What did that sacrifice look like?
I mean, I would just say I don't think we had much balance in life at all for the first, call it 3 or 4 years of the business. We spent it's an interesting thing, because I think we spent most of our hours on Morning Brew, but I was actually talking about this with someone on Twitter yesterday, which is like, even if, say, you find balance like in your time, I think the second, like kind of the meta layer to this is mental balance. Because even if you're not spending all of your time on a business, where's your head at? I think is another question. And it's a harder one to really face and to change. So I think even at times when I wasn't working on my business, I was working on my business. It was just happening upstairs. And so I think that was one of the trade-offs is we just had no balance in life. The other thing is I wouldn't necessarily call this a trade-off, but it was very much something to deal with is there were a ton of haters along the way. And the most interesting thing is the haters in a lot of cases were actually, I think, my friends. And I wouldn't call them haters like they wanted to see me fail. They just thought I was an idiot. They literally just thought I was an idiot. And what the hell is he doing building this like newsletter thing? Like Wall Street Journal, CNBC, Reuters have been around for centuries. Like, what is he doing? So for a long time, I had to just like kind of in a weird way tune out a lot of my friends who thought it was just sheer stupidity leaving my job in finance to do this. And I would say the other, I wouldn't say trade-off, but thing that I think I had to face earlier in life, which was painful at the time, but I think actually allowed me to grow a lot, is I very much say that like entrepreneurship is a catalyst for growth as an individual, actually in way more of a way than it is for you as like a professional. Sure, you learn how to build a business and run a business. That is great. But I think I learned more about like my psyche and like what motivates me and like what brings me joy, what I feel very self-conscious about, where my ego shows. I think I learned that as a function of building a business. And I think if I hadn't been doing that, that would have showed up at some point later in life. And so there's, I think, a yin and yang to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I realized the same thing. I mean, having started a business in college and having that personal reckoning with yourself of like, at some point, you have to pay the piper, and like your flaws as a human have
Yep.
to come to bear. And the benefits of starting a company when you're young is like you're sort of forced to expose those things very quickly, and there are very real consequences, if you
Yeah.
don't, and also very real benefits, right? Like I don't know about you, I was not what you would call, a social butterfly when I was in high school or
No.
college. But I started to realize about midway through college, when we were in the process of selling our ads business to USA Today, I was like, wait, if I'm as soon as I get on the phone in a business context, I will call anybody, I will talk to anybody, I can charm the pants off someone. So why is it
Yeah.
that then when I walk in the student center at Hofstra, I clam up and won't open my mouth?
Oh, totally. It's so interesting that you say that because I experienced the exact same thing, which was like high school was a very, I would say, just like emotionally insecure time in my life. I didn't feel like I belonged to any group. I
Yeah.
felt like definitely outside of the social circle. I didn't feel necessarily comfortable in my skin or in conversations. Whereas in business, it was actually the weirdest thing. Whereas in business, like you tell me to sell Morning Brew to any person on planet Earth, I am the most things I don't feel like crazy conviction on. I feel crazy conviction that I can better sell any human being on Morning Brew and why they should spend money with us better than any person on planet Earth. And it was such an interesting thing because I had never felt that level of confidence in my life. I will also add like that, those experiences growing up, like not feeling like I belonged, feeling like even like being like bullied in middle school and high school. I think one of the best motivators for business, other than like kind of living my dad's legacy, feeling an obligation to provide for my family, was also like feeling a chip on my shoulder. And when I talk to some of like the most successful entrepreneurs and professionals, both at Morning Brew and outside of it, to me, that is like a unifying theme. And by the way, I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but this aspect of a chip on your shoulder and doing things to prove the haters wrong, I found to be one of the greatest sources of motivation for a lot of people.
Oh, big time. Yeah. I mean, Larry Ellison actually said it best in an interview with 60 Minutes years ago. He said, I have all the disadvantages required for success.
Yeah, I love that.
Like that motivation usually comes from like some kind of childhood trauma or whatever. I mean, for me, it was the same thing. I had a lot of Friday nights in high school sitting at home because I was not getting invited to parties.
Totally.
I was just not in the in
100%.
group. And I'm like, Man, I'll show them one day.
Yeah, it sounds like we had very similar childhoods.
Yeah. So, shifting gears for a second, but kind of on this sort of this wavelength of, mental health and things like that. When you think about something, we had a session earlier in the conference about employee burnout,
Yep.
right? And I got to imagine for a company like yours, the stakes are high. They continue to get higher. You've got growth projections that you've got to hit. You also, because of sort of the consumer aspect of your business, you're sort of under a microscope. So expectations are really high from your readers. And then amidst all that, you throw a pandemic into the mix. I guess, talk to me how, whether it's you and Austin, your leadership team, like how have your thoughts on just the employee experience and burnout, all that stuff, how has that evolved over the last 12, 18 months?
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of things here. I think the first thing is the lesson we learned early on in the business, which is that actually like being penny pinchers in business is not always the best strategy. And what I mean by that is Austin and I were so far from the spectrum of raising so much capital, blowing that capital stupidly, right? Like that's one side of the spectrum. Most companies sit somewhere in the middle. And Austin and I were on the totally opposite side where we were not entirely bootstrapped. We had raised $750,000, but we were closer to bootstrap than a venture-backed business. And Austin and I as people, like we don't spend anything in life. I was joking with Austin this morning that like my splurge this weekend was buying a pair of pants from Lululemon. And so like the thing that I think really got wrong in the early days of the business was one, because we were first time entrepreneurs, we were more reactive versus proactive. We weren't planning ahead. We were always reacting to what was happening in the day to day of the business. But also that meant because of also like our being frugal, we didn't hire enough people. We were always operating at capacity. We were always running our team to 100%. And so what ended up happening is as people decided to leave or someone was sick for the day or someone wanted to go on vacation, something would break. Either the machine would break or a person would break. And I remember, I'll never forget this. Our first employee we ever hired at Morning Brew, employee number one, the first writer we ever hired, left within 3 months because we probably should have hired 2 writers who could team up on the newsletter to write together. But instead, we hired one person. He was getting into the office at 9 a.m. and he was literally staying in the office until 1 a.m. to finish the newsletter. And so that was a first big lesson for us is like, when you operate a business at 100% of your needs today, you're going to end up burning people out or the machine is going to break. As it relates to like now at scale with 140 people on the team, I think the biggest thing is honestly just like leading through example and example in action. And what I mean by that is like, I think a lot of companies, and even for us for a period of time, we're very performative in nature where we were like, balance is really important. We're doing, summer Fridays and all these things. Take your vacation days. We don't want to see any left by the end of the year. But then if the senior leaders, we have an 8-person senior leadership team now. If our senior leaders weren't taking those days, well, it didn't mean jack shit what we were saying because the teams would just look up to their boss or their boss's boss and be like, yeah, I don't feel really comfortable taking a week-long vacation when the head of our organization hasn't taken a day off in 18 months. And it even, this probably happened like a year and a half ago at this point. Time's strange with COVID is an employee basically saying that they were worried about burnout at Morning Brew because they felt like Austin and I always worked. And the example that they gave was that they saw the green dot of Slack on at all hours. And that was just like yet another point of awareness that I think it brought to Austin and I to have self-awareness around any action that is visible by our team that shows working will be taken as working. And then it will be repeated by people in the organization because that is taken as the right thing to do. So I honestly think like more so than just like having a great people partner and saying that balance is really good. It's like, just like do the actual shit you're talking about. So if you have a senior leadership team and you have yourself as co-founders and you're talking about balance is really important, well, then log off at 6 p.m. if that's what you're talking about, or take all of your 2 weeks in a given year. And I think like it sounds so obvious, but my argument would be most companies aren't actually doing this.
No, of course they're not. Yeah. And also, but it's tough, I think, when you're looking at startups or just, small businesses that are growing quickly, what have you, if you're lucky enough to have people that are passionate enough about what they do, that that they're going to follow you and put in those long
Yep.
hours. I mean, that's also a huge responsibility, for you as the leader to say, hey, you know what, I know better than this. It was something I was talking to our head of people, Jamie, about 6 months ago. Is she was saying, there's a certain type of person that is comfortable running at 100 and 110% all the time.
Yep.
Okay, but most of the people that are going to come work at your company are not, or if they think they are, it's not sustainable. And that's another thing too. It's like the things that put you in the headspace to want to start this business and to persevere through a lot of the things you went through are unusual qualities that might give you
Totally.
an unusual tolerance to hours
Yeah.
worked and stress, and that not everyone's going to share necessarily.
Yeah. And also, by the way, I would argue that that type of person changes a lot over the life of the business. Like I would say in the early days, our team was a bunch of like 23-year-old hustlers who were just like willing this thing into existence. We were in a 9x9 WeWork office. We were all shoulder to shoulder, and we were working all the time. And I think it very much was one, a function of like all these people were super early, and so they felt as much owners in the business as we did, like just because of where it was in the life of the business. But also, it's just like a bunch of young people right out of college, didn't have families, didn't have kids. It was like, it was at least more within what was realistic or possible for them to do that. So I think that was even a mental progression that Austin and I had to make, is as the team went from, what's often talked about in like the blitz scaling models, like family to tribe to village to city. As we went from like family to tribe and tribe to village, the expectation just had to change, because we were going to start having people who looked at Morning Brew as a job. And that's okay. Right. That is an okay thing. It is just an evolution.
Yeah, I mean, I think the same thing happened at our company. I remember I think it was back in 2017, we were like, I don't know, call it 20 employees. And I went home on a Friday night, and it was, I don't know, 7:30, 8 o'clock. Around 9:15, I realized I had left some things at the office. I walked back, elevator doors open. It sounds like there's a dance party going on in the office. And I'm like, oh man, maybe like a couple of the guys went down to the bar, came back up, whatever. I opened the door. You would have thought it was midday on a Wednesday. There were still 14 of the 20 people there. There's music blasting. They're getting laptops out the door. They're answering support tickets. They're doing all this stuff. And I'm like, and on the, and so at the time I was like, this is incredible. Like everyone's just in it to win it at 9 o'clock on a Friday night. And, in the early days, that's what's required. But to your point, the company evolves. And like now, I mean, I'm in our office right now. If I came back here on a Friday night and I saw 75 people chanting, I think we're doing something wrong. You know?
No, it's so true.
But speaking of the early talent, when you look at the folks on your team, right? Some of those 23-year-olds that were working till 1 a.m. back then, or maybe it's even people that have joined you recently but made a big impression. When you think about those employees who, you look at them and you say, this is a superstar. This is someone who's really going to go to the distance with us. What are the qualities that have really jumped out at you that you identify across all those folks?
Yeah. I think the first is an obsessive thinker. Like, I am super OCD, and I am someone who gets obsessed when I get interested in something. Those are always the people that have done best in the business, is the people who know what it truly means to go down the rabbit hole, right? Like our first writer, second writer, first writer was the person I mentioned that left the business, who's our managing editor today, our second writer ever. He had no professional writing experience. He had written for his college newspaper, and that was the only writing he had ever done in his life. But he was such a sponge of information, and he just wanted it more than any other person, that like to this day, he will be editing our newsletter from like a highway stop in Colorado because he like has such a love for reading the internet and distilling it for 3 million people. Our first engineer ever, who was quasi like engineer, product growth person, he did all the jobs. He was a self-taught engineer. He didn't study comp sci. He taught himself everything. He built Morning Brew's referral program from scratch. He had started a business in college. It didn't work out. But he's the type of person that if he wants to learn, like he wanted to learn C or Java, he literally went to the local library, checked out the textbook and just read it cover to cover. And it like, again, it sounds so simple, but no one actually does the work. And I'm not surprised at all that, he's since left Morning Brew and he's starting another company right now. And he has that type of brain. So I would say one is the obsessive brain. I would say second is like the chip on your shoulder thing really is something that like stands out to me is like our best employees are people. One of our senior people at Morning Brew, when I was talking with them about what motivates them, they said they've had so many managers that have made them feel belittled, that have made them feel lesser than, that have made them feel like they can't get to their level. And he just wants to prove all of them wrong. So like that I have found to be an X factor in a number of employees. And I would say the final piece is I never can quite define this one, but someone who just gets it. Like Austin and I will talk about like we hire someone who like they just get it. They just understand it. And that's the one that I still have trouble explaining what just getting it means. But when you see someone who gets it, you know what it means. And generally when you think someone gets it, they end up being a really good employee.
That's the X factor though. That's hard to find.
Totally. And what I will say though is like, look, it is really hard being an early employee in a startup. It's incredibly gratifying. You learn a shit ton. But I think the reason it's so hard is because you go from being a generalist in the early days, doing 10 different things, and you have to grow as fast as the company is growing. And if it's a really successful company that's growing at a fast trajectory, sometimes, even if you're a great employee, it is impossible to escalate as fast as the company is escalating.
Yeah.
But to me, the other factor on top of that is if you start doing 10 things, as the company starts growing really fast and there becomes more layers where you go from a 1-layer company to 2 or 3 layers with managers and then senior leaders, it's also the type of thing that you go from generalist to specialist. And I think that's a very hard mental transition for early employees to make, feeling like they have ownership over what feels like the whole business to owning one part of a bigger business. And I think that mental transition is extremely difficult for many early employees.
Particularly if you're young, because you might not have the context.
Exactly.
And it can just be tough because you go from sort of being a big fish in a small pond, having a lot of success, having your hands on a lot of things, to all of a sudden mentally making sense of, wait, I have less things now, which a younger person is going to interpret that as that's not as good as what I had before. And yeah,
100%. And by the way, like I think that's why expectation setting is such an important thing. And I think why first-time entrepreneurs are really bad at setting expectations.
Totally.
Because like Austin and I were really bad at it. All we wanted was to sell people and come into the business and do everything possible to oversell the business. But like in the early days, most of our employees knew so much of the information about the business, from our financials to our open rates, like everything, right? But if we think about an 140 person business, every employee knowing every detail of the business, it's not even a privacy thing. It's more so, it's not going to help people do their jobs. It may actually just confuse them if they don't have the full picture. So you're not going to share everything. But if you are an early employee who is used to seeing all of the things, how do you reconcile with seeing maybe a tenth of what you used to see?
Yeah, or I'm not in the meeting with the other executives anymore.
Exactly.
I'm not in the boardroom anymore. Like, yeah, that's tough. The point about learning is a really interesting one, because I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. And actually Dick Costello, he was the former CEO of Twitter and one of our investors. He pointed that out when I first met him. He's like, look, this is not for everybody, but the only thing that separates someone who's able to go the distance versus someone who's unable to scale with a high growth company is the speed that you learn.
Yep.
Essentially being good at your job and scaling with the company. His point was, it's just a byproduct of learning as fast as possible. If you're learning outpaces the growth of the business, you'll be there forever if you want to be.
Exactly. And I think at the end of the day, it's a question of like, what's going to motivate you to do it. And right, like, so I talked about like the chip on your shoulder. To me, that's like one clear motivator. It's not the only motivator, but that's why you need something that gives you that fire to just like constantly learn over the long term, thanklessly. And there's only I would say a finite grouping of things that do that. Like, I think a chip on your shoulder is one. For a small group of people, it's just like a genuine love for learning. But I think there are so few people, when they say they love to learn, that actually know what it means to like go really deep and learn. A lot of people say they're curious. And then I would say there's a third bucket of people who are not founders that are either doing it for their family or for some other X factor. But that's the hard thing, is creating that extra fire and finding that extra fire in people you hire is really hard. But if you can find it, you just know that person's going to outwork and outlearn everyone else.
Yeah. Well, we're coming up on time here, but I think this is a sort of a great segue into really one of the last things I want to ask you, which is talking about learning. We're talking about ambition. In a nutshell, to the extent you can share, what's next for the brew? What's next for you personally? Where do you want to see things in the next 5+ years?
Yeah, it's that's the question. That's what I ask myself every day. So as it relates to the brew, I mean, at the end of the day, Morning Brew is going to be synonymous with the word business for our generation. I liken what CNBC and the Wall Street Journal was for our parents' generation. Morning Brew is going to be that for this entire generation of modern business leaders. But I think what's even more exciting than kind of the old guard of media is that the connection between content and community and commerce is closer than ever before because of the internet. So Morning Brew not only has the ability to build this massive audience across everything, newsletter, podcast, social, audio, but once we've built this trusted audience, which I would argue is one of the last things to be commoditized in this world where everything's becoming commoditized. Once we've built that audience, we've also basically built a massive owned marketing channel, which so few people have. And so you have the ability to monetize your trusted audience with products that they love. And so, everyone, shits on media's advertising-based business model. First of all, like, I think we found
Which
that
is an unfair criticism, because if you had to pay for all those websites, I don't think people would feel the same way.
Exactly right. Like if everything was behind a paywall, there would be the very fair argument that all of a sudden you're hamstringing lower income folks who can't afford all of these subscriptions the ability to consume content and democratize knowledge. So yeah, I think the argument is bullshit, but I think what we're basically doing is we're building an entire media brand and consumer brand around business with a class of people who are going to run companies over the next 5 to 15 years. And we're super excited about that. And I'm excited to shepherd this future and be as much of a support as I can be to Austin, who took over as the CEO.
That was sort of my follow-up was, where, because I know obviously there's been some shifts in that have led the company. So where do you fit in, and what role are you playing in all this?
Yeah, totally. So basically the long story short is executive chairman. I'm focused on a few things. One is helping to support Austin in some of the bigger strategic decisions of the business long-term. Second is interfacing with our partner, the acquirer of the business, Business Insider and Axel Springer. And the third is kind of just being the biggest cheerleader of the business. Obviously, I have naturally biased towards content creation and brand building. So being a megaphone for Morning Brew to tell this story as we evolve from newsletter business to media brand is a really important thing. But overall, like one of the coolest things has been for me to realize the part of business building that I love most. And for me, what I love most is the act of building, like truly being in the ground floor and building things. What I don't love most and what I'm not uniquely qualified to do is operating and scaling. And what's been amazing is like, I have a partner and a co-founder who I'm like the luckiest person. I didn't pick with all this in mind when we were starting the business, who what he doesn't love to do is actually the in the weeds building from the initial idea 0 to 1. But what he loves doing is thinking methodically about scaling. And so to have, rather than have to look outside of the business for a new CEO, have a partner who's perfect for the stage of the business we're at. It's a really uniquely privileged thing for us to be able to have. And so I'm just trying to support him in every way as we go on to become $1 billion media brand.
Wow. I love it. Super impressive. Thank you for taking the time. I think this is fantastic. And for anybody watching, Alex does not keep a low profile on the internet, so I won't even go through the social handles. He's very easy to find. Alex, thank you.
No, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.